Good afternoon, ONA Dublin. Welcome to all the capos and the consigliaries of the Irish online mafia. To everyone else, you having a great day? Yes? I know all day, I'm realizing now, first of all, I cannot say how grateful, honored I feel to be giving the keynote at ONA Dublin. Again, I'm going to keep saying that, it just sounds so great. I really believe it's an honor to be here today to close out. I want to say thank you so much to ONA for inviting me. Thank you to Facebook. It's also a huge burden. I realize I'm the only thing that's standing between Claire Wardle and a G&T, between the rest of you guys and a Storyful party. And I can tell you right now, there ain't no party like a Storyful party, because a Storyful party don't stop. We all know that. There's actually people in the room, executives for Storyful, that come with their protein bars, because Storyfillers will just drink through the hunger. Anyway, that's me, and it's a terrible position for an Irishman to be in, to stop you guys from getting that juicy glass or whatever. But I want to just challenge you a little bit, right? So I know all day you guys have been at the coalface. You have been nerding out on details about new product and technology and AI and VR and KPIs and all the good stuff. And I want to ask you to take a big, deep breath and step back, because I'm going to ask you to take just a couple of moments to think about the global context in which we as journalists are working today in 2017. And I want to ask you to recognize for a moment, this big globe spinning here, to recognize that it's never been a better time to be alive on this planet. Every single major index of human progress, we are doing better at an exponential rate of growth. So who here, I think this morning we're talking about the millennials, was born after 1990? Hands up. Okay, so millennials here in the audience, right? Since you guys were born, that year, 1990, 4 out of 10 people on the planet Earth lived in extreme poverty. Today, it's 1 in 10. Since 1990, people are living 6 years on average longer than they did back in 1990. Diseases have been wiped off the face of the earth since 1990 that affected hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. Polio paralyzed 350,000 kids back in 1990. Last year, there were 37 cases. In every single index, bar obviously big issues like climate change and terrorism, on every single index that affects our lives, things are getting better. Even in Western societies, crime, murder, all dropping. Nutrition, way up. Education, our IQs are up. Not despite, but because of the internet. So why is it not that people are out in the streets chanting for more of the same? Why do political leaders not stand before us and tell us you've never had it so good? And why is it that this is what we hear?
The world is a mess. The world is as angry as it gets.
On one side, he's totally wrong. The world is not a mess. But Donald Trump is right when he says the world has never been so angry. And what I'm asking you to consider, just for this last 20 minutes of this conference, is that those of us here who are agents of change, people who advocate change, people who go in and battle for change every single day in our organizations, sometimes don't take stock of the fact that most people, change scares the bejesus out of them. At every moment of great departure in communications, way back to Gutenberg, the more things changed, the more nervous people became, the more they resisted, the more they feared it, the more they feared the people who actually created the change, whether that was technological change or social change. And so in our case, when you think about the fear of change, it's commonly expressed these days in a distrust of the people who set the rules. The elites, the people who don't have our backs, who don't care about us. And when you look, for example, just a couple of months back, Edelman do their annual trust barometer across the Western world. They found for the first time in the majority of countries, the majority of people did not trust the mainstream institutions to do what is right. Now that included the media, but this is part of a broader collapse in trust in Western societies. And just in case you think that it's just the American people who distrust the media elite, right? This is 32% according to Gallup this year. It's also right across the Western world. Here in Ireland, according to Edelman, 59% of people in this country believe the system has failed them. Just 29% of Irish people trust the Irish media, the least trusted institution in society in this country. Again, my point is that this moment of great change, when all of us, I think, are involved in online news, couldn't be more excited by many of the things we're able to do as journalists. People don't trust us to a greater extent, and it's part of a wider social problem. And I think just important for the last few minutes, and this sounds like I am terribly pessimistic. I am the most optimistic man in the world. I've never been more optimistic. I've got so much optimism, huge. Channeling my Donald Trump here. But it's really important to step back for a moment and realize at a moment of great change, we are the people advocating it. We just be conscious of this collapse, this implosion of trust, as Edelman described it. Now, I became a journalist because I could do nothing else, right? From the age of 4 years old, I fought my father for the Irish Times. At the age of 15, I had a teacher who wrote a report card saying I was prematurely cynical, which led me to this job. This is me in 1990, 1991. It's my first publicity shot. I was a radio journalist for RTE. It is amazing how little I have changed since that photograph was taken. But also amazing how much journalism has changed. I mean, take a look. Right behind me there are reel-to-reel tapes. We used to cut them with a razor blade, right? Reel-to-reel. This is before mobile phones, quite obviously, before journalists had dress sense. Look at the size of that computer. I mean, the scale of change over the period of time that I have been in this business has been quite remarkable. It's about 25 years. I went on to become the anchorman for Primetime, which is kind of like the equivalent of Newsnight or Nightline if you're American. And, old media was really good to me. I had a great job. I was doing really well until Twitter came along. And I started to understand that there were now many more ways for people to call me an asshole and tell me how biased I was and attack my performance in television. I also started to understand one more thing. Twitter was making it really smart. I would walk into my editorial meetings at Primetime and I would have a suggestion from somebody in the crowd that was going to make that night's broadcast. I started to understand that this was the middle of the financial crisis in Ireland, 2009. I was going to bat against the finance minister and I was armed with questions from people, the wisdom in the crowd, on Twitter, who knew more about me than some aspect of the financial system. And I could walk in and challenge the Minister for Finance with something I had asked for on Twitter. And not only was I asking, but it was changing the nature of my journalism. I was getting to a point where social interaction, what became known as audience engagement, didn't know it then, was making me a better journalist and making the journalism that I was part of better as well. It felt to me like something was happening. It was a golden age. At the same time, this is me as a foreign correspondent, I was also deeply affected by a realization, again, a fear, that it used to be to get a story to a mass audience, you had to have your satellite dish, your printing press, your radio transmitter. It wasn't that glamorous. People talk about the good old days of being a foreign correspondent. It was a logistical nightmare, not very authentic. And that was Iran. This is Iran, 2009. I remember seeing the images of young people on the streets with a smartphone, a connection to a social network, and they were the journalists now. The means of production of news had been just revolutionized in almost an historical blink of an eye. You no longer needed to be a journalist. It was a scary thought, but I kept thinking to myself, that phrase that Clay Shirky came up with, remember back at the first wave of exhilaration of here comes everybody. It's a phrase actually taken from Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce, by the way. That idea that suddenly, if we could find a way for journalists to mediate their interaction with this wisdom in the crowd, the people that were changing the nature of the things we were observing, if we could form new partnerships, this could be a golden age for storytelling. And I was convinced of that to the extent that if you walk out of this building, you turn right, go over a bridge, there was a tiny office about 2 minutes walk away from here that we founded an organization called Storyful. And I love this video that was created by Google about the organization a couple of years ago. Just a couple of seconds.
We are part of a golden age of journalism and storytelling. Everybody now is a storyteller. There's hundreds of hours of YouTube video uploaded every single minute. But when everybody's telling a story, which stories are worth listening to?
Storyful is the first social media news agency in the world.
One of the big stories we've been covering today is Yemen. We found this pretty dramatic video. So what we want to do is go to Google Maps, establish the location. We find the building here, which matches exactly. And now we're going to attempt to get clearance for the content and provide it to our clients for use. Hi, Mike.
So I get teary-eyed nostalgia when I watch that. The great people of Storyful in this room and bringing us out later on. I think I won't talk about it too much. You've heard a lot about that company, but we were, and I think we still are, or it is still a part of a vanguard of the first wave of the social web in how it liberated our ability as journalists to leverage that wisdom in the crowd, to separate the news from the noise as, service providers to other journalists. And I think there's so many people have come as part of that vanguard that are now revolutionizing that aspect of engagement. The problem was, just as we were getting better at handling this shift in the means of production, the means of distribution and consumption of news were changing in more dramatic ways, more sinister ways. And the way in which consumers were being forced to cope with information overload, the sheer scale of the information that they were dealing with. They didn't have Storyfuls to help them. And essentially, if you look at the statistic, it's quite stunning. 5 times as much information is consumed today by the average American than in 1986. And if you listen to Sarah earlier from Critica talking about what happens to the human brain when it's confronted with this scale of information, it falls back on what the scientists call heuristics. These are the biases or the shortcuts the brain takes in the face of too much information or too little information. Confirmation bias, you believe what you already think of the world. You believe your friend and neighbor more than the expert. You believe vivid testimony, not the sort of dry statistics from the expert. And so what's happened is, as people face more information overload, they are basically turning away from trusted sources. It's the great paradox of this second wave. Because what they're doing, obviously, is they're going to where their friends and family are. They trust us less, and they trust their friends and family more. And where do those friends and family go? Clearly, they go to social networks. So in this second wave, as the means of distribution of journalism has shifted away from us to them, to the platforms, you are all aware of the statistical realities about how many people get their news from Facebook, for example. You all know about the movement of the business model as well. 89% of the growth in digital advertising last year went to the big duopoly on the social platforms. Now, I have to say, given where we're standing today, this was not intended. Jack Dorsey, Mark Zuckerberg did not get up in the morning the day they founded their platforms and think, we want to build the biggest news distribution network known to humanity. They didn't. This is unintended consequences. But whatever the intention, the reality now is that news is flowing through a pipe that is ranked and priced on the basis of emotion, not quality and not trust, because obviously this is a model that depends on advertising. It needs to move people. And so therefore, if you're in the programmatic bucket of advertising, you are priced on the basis of your ability to make people laugh, cry, be animated in some form. And so as a result, the same pipe that carries the furry cat and the fake news is the same pipe that carries the real news. And in that pipeline, the real news has to be as, if not more, outrageous and emotional to get the kind of eyeballs it needs to generate revenue. And essentially, that leaves us in a position where we have a model. I mean, if you think about designing a model to erode trust in news and information, you could not design a better model than the one we sit in right now. And my argument would be, again, I am optimistic, believe me, there has to be that realization of the context we're working in. If we're to start getting down on each individual newsroom, each individual journalist, we have to recognize that first and think about what would happen if we started from scratch. So what would happen if we recognized that we used to have an information economy where obviously people's potential was liberated by having access to the world's information on a desktop, on their mobile? People don't need any more information in reality. What they're craving is trust. So what would happen if we started to think about replacing this information economy with an architecture, a business model, but more than just a business model, that was designed to create and rebuild trust in the information sources that people get, to persuade them that they can turn back to trusted information sources like us, to journalists? What would it be like? Now, I want to argue again that it's not about platforms changing, global newsrooms coming up with new innovation, or technologists getting us out of this. It's a responsibility for every single one of us in this room and as evangelists for change to be the architects of this trust economy, to be the trust architects. And I think the great news is that we are starting to see those examples making real differences in very tangible ways. First of all, in terms of money. It's all about money, right? What we're seeing is a movement, obviously, away from dependence on advertising, particularly that kind of automated system that we've just talked about, to a direct transaction between the user and the journalist, in some cases, the news organization. We all know the Trump bump happened. We know that trusted information sources like the New York Times have seen a huge jump in subscriptions for digital-only packages, 40% this quarter up on last year's first quarter. And I think it's true, obviously, for many leading newspapers. I'm particularly impressed by people like the Financial Times and The Economist, particularly in the US, and seeing how they have managed to capitalize on a moment when people are thinking about the consequences of misinformation. But it's not just because of Trump, and it's not just the United States. If you take a look back to Europe, for example, I pick one example from Norway, Aftenposten, subscriptions up 100% year on year. What struck me about this example was what the executive said about this as an example, because quite clearly, if you move toward this direct transactional business model, it starts to change the nature of who you are. Every day, editorial meetings used to be about traffic. It's now about articles which draw subscribers. The act of subscription changes the nature of the journalism. The bad news is that the subscription model, I think, the way it is right now, is not fit for purpose. It's obsolescent. I think we'll look back in maybe 20 years' time and laugh at the idea that while we were consuming our music and our movies from Netflix and Spotify in nicely packaged, priced bundles, we're still being expected by journalism to pay for multiple individual subscriptions to the siloed content reservoirs they have behind the paywall. I'm not saying that this is not great news to see these subscriptions up, but we got to be thinking about the innovation in payment. We got to be thinking, for example, about models pioneered by European startups like Blendle, now launching in the United States, which has been based on a micropayment model. Not necessarily sure myself personally, I think this is the solution, but it's a wave of innovation happening out of plain sight. We're seeing, for example, others, PennyPass, LaterPay, Scroll, Discourse. I mean, I could go on for the entire duration of the rest of this evening about the people who are trying out new ways of getting people to pay directly. It's not just in the news business. Take a look at Patreon. Patreon is a creator donation fund, which essentially now this year will probably get $150 million into the hands of people creating high-quality content from 1 million patrons who are supplying essentially the cash that is spurring a new form of creativity. And journalism, I think, is one of those areas of creativity that we could see benefiting from this. I'm not even going to touch on tipping, on memberships, on events. The bottom line is there are so many more ways to have that direct relationship financially with your user. I'd also just like to say another principle that I really would evangelize from this meeting today is the difference between truth and trust. We heard it earlier from Sarah, as I was quoting earlier on, how it's not enough to have facts. You can beat people over the head with facts. Many cases, they'll retreat from you. They don't want to believe what you've got to sell them. So truth, facts are preconditions of what we do, but they're not necessarily sufficient. We've got to be thinking about how we build faith in the process that led to that fact, to that truth. And of all the people who've done work in this area, I was struck by this sense of what transparency, exposing the workings of a newsroom can do to build that trust. This is the Trust Project, which obviously helped Google, working with the good people in Santa Clara, baking the evidence of trustworthy reporting, accuracy, transparency, inclusion directly into the news process itself. So it's not enough just to talk about what you produced, you've got to show people how the sausage is made. Transparency being a key to the architecture of trust. I think let's review that, go back to that Here Comes Everybody for a moment, because I always think about this and it reminds me that one of the real problems we face right now is we venerate scale, right? We have to, because we've got to reach those big audiences. We use words like reach, and we want to get to as many possible eyeballs, even if we only glance those eyeballs for a couple of seconds. Let's stop thinking about Here Comes Everybody. Let's talk about Here Comes Somebody. Let's look at building a new model, a new trust economy based on the depth of your engagement with the individual, not your glancing engagement with millions of people. And let's start to obviously understand that we have access to more data about what people are doing. So we can start to understand that we're not just talking about people who are members of a demographic advertising cohort. 18 to 24-year-olds living in the city, man, woman. It's not enough. People have multiple needs every single day. You might send them the best video at 8 o'clock in the morning, but if they're commuting in their car, it doesn't matter. And that's what at the moment, because we rely on a shallow advertising model, we are not seeking to understand the nature of people's lives every single day. We're not understanding that they may have multiple identities every single day. They may love Korean pop music at the same time being really interested in budgetary policy in the United States. They can do so at exactly the same time. So by focusing on the direct engagement and a financial transaction with the individual, I think we start to access and leverage the kind of data that we can get access to from the way people live their lives, use their phones, and consume our content. There's loads of examples, as I say. I have a list of people that I would love to evangelize right here. I think first of all, for me, I'm so impressed by the work done by Harkin. The kind of process that I sort of talked about when I started to come to Twitter is now being essentially mechanized and built at scale by this organization. They're essentially building the tools that will allow community to take part in your reporting. And the key for me is that quote, actions speak louder than clicks. What they're saying is, if you want to listen to an audience, you've got to take into account what they say and reflect that in the journalism that results from your engagement with the audience. You've all heard probably of the work of The Correspondent, just launched in the United States with the support of Jay Rosen. I was really struck by the model that they have built. It's a membership model. People are paying them as a group, and they're taking part in the reporting. And again, the nature of listening to your audience changed the nature of your journalism. They're not worried about saving journalism. What they're talking about is essentially creating a world through the journalism that makes sense to people. And it's not just startups. I'm looking, Christian Science Monitor is one of my favorite examples of a big legacy news organization that has gone solely for digital subscription. And what they landed on, they say themselves, was a deeper relationship with our readers, making people more thoughtful, less neurotic, more calm, and seeing the world through the lens of progress, which starts to open up a really tantalizing possibility. Remember when I talked about poverty earlier on? Well, if the headline was positive, less neurotic, and more calm, today the headline would have been that 130,000 people were dragged out of extreme poverty today, every 24 hours. So what we're starting to talk about now is solutions journalism. We used to think of ourselves as speaking truth to power, as tearing down the elites. And now what we're starting to see, I think, through experiments and direct engagement, is more focus on the idea of pointing out problems but also solutions, giving people a sense that at a time when the only constant is change, that they do have the power to make a difference, that our journalism is giving them a sense that they don't have to be passive observers or victims of an elite. And I think, again, changing our thought process changes the nature of the journalism for the better. Now, I'm very aware, as being the old guy in the room, with a few other old people in the room as well, of being scared about the notion that journalism will be just deeply personalized, that it will be all about you. Is it going to make the relationship worse? The filter bubble itself is all about me serving you what you already want to hear and your preferences. I share those fears. But again, if you are looking at the right signal, if you're not asking people what they consumed last week, what they like, what they want, and examining through the data exactly what they do every day and what they need at any point in that day, I think then you start building the trust that allows us to develop a deeper relationship around journalism as a public utility. You can challenge them if they trust you. You cannot challenge them if they don't trust you. And I think by having more journalism as a personal service, it gives us the ability to build the credibility of journalism as a public utility, as a place where we come and we share commonly accepted facts about our society. I think the one area I probably haven't touched on is advertising. I don't particularly no fan of advertising in its current model, but I do think innovation in advertising is possible if we can start looking to ways that advertisers and sponsors can actually be sponsors of the content, very much like Spotify. Maybe people they will buy content with money, but maybe not their own money. Maybe it'll be sponsors' money. So I think there's ways in which we can get away from the programmatic ad buying and the distortion that causes to have sponsorship models that might work as long as people are given permission or asked to give permission to the data they share. I think one of the dangers that I do see, and that is not discussed enough at conferences like this, is the increasing push toward regulation and protection of user data. We have GDPR coming down the line here in Europe, which is basically going to force anybody who is harvesting your data to seek your permission to make you aware of what they're doing. And I think that is a step forward for the user, but it's a big danger for us in journalism, because right now anyone dependent on this advertising model is essentially harvesting people's attention and selling it off, and that will have to stop. So finally, I'm going to leave it just to say, for me, I am a fan of personalization. I'm a fan of chatbots. I'm a fan of getting deeper acquainted with the individual. One of the elephant in the rooms in a place like sort of today, in a place like this, is the relationship between platforms and publishers. And I think for me personally, we're a lot alike. I mean, there's a very introverted culture. I know this because I've worked inside a platform and I've worked inside publishers. There are very introverted cultures. We kind of tend to talk to ourselves. We talk about product a lot. We don't talk about users a lot. I think for me personally, it seems that platforms have to own up to the fact that there have been unintended consequences, and we have to make sure that they address those unintended consequences, not through marketing, but through changes to the product. Technology doesn't move in a straight line. I think from the point of view of publishers, we've also got to start learning some new cliches. I think many cases I hear people in innovation and journalism still using words like disruption. I mean, in reality, do the users want more disruption? Do people want us to break shit and break things, or do we want to build things? We get a focus in our talking about scale and about reach. Again, let's drop those kinds of cliches. It's all about user focus. Now, I've had a career in pretty much every different aspect of online journalism. I've been my own boss. I worked for Jack Dorsey, Rupert Murdoch, the Irish taxpayer. So I kind of seen it all. I'm now at the beginning of a new journey. I'll be supporting some of the people that I believe are trust architects in an advisory capacity. I'm starting out my own venture to try and answer some of those questions about how we develop a deeper relationship to individuals that reflects their identity. How do we reward their attention at the point of intention rather than give them reasons not to be bored at work? So for me personally, this is a very personal view of what's happening in journalism right now. And like I say, let's get rid of the old cliches. Forget about, I see over here, move fast and learn things, right? Well, okay, calm down for a moment, right? There's two cliches that stand out from my time with the Silicon Valley company that more than ever, I think, should be our credo. The first is, fall in love with the problem, not with the solution. Fall in love with the user, not the product. Just because you think that your page loading faster, does the reader care about that? I think for me personally, those two things are what we should be thinking about more as we think about the creation of a trust economy. I'm going to leave it there, except to say, I mean, as I start out, it really is coming down to those two things. I'm really impressed by, for me, as I got exposed to Silicon Valley culture, this concept of an obsession with the customer. Because that's basically what it's all about. If you're building innovation within a news organization, you're building a new startup, you want to be that trust architect. It's as simple as this. It's what's the person's need and your ability to meet that need. Everything else is bullshit. You've got to strip it right down to those two things. And as far as I'm concerned, it's as simple and it's as complicated as that. Thank you. So, I mean, that's my rant. I would love to take some questions and maybe start a dialogue just the last few minutes before you go off and have your nice gin and tonic. Does anyone have any question about anything I've raised or something you think I may have left out? We have Orly here with a microphone. Yes?
Thanks, Orla. That was very interesting, Mark. Thanks very much. Just a comment on the personalization of news, and that speaks to some of the findings of our study on online news consumption in terms of how people consume news, and especially the embeddedness of users in social contexts. So I think we sometimes perhaps tend to overlook that users are not really individuals, but they're already part of social groups and communities. So that might address your fear of over-personalization on the one hand, but also it might help shift a little bit our gaze from the individual user to how users are in fact already part of communities, and that a lot of their news consumption is driven by the fact that they are part of these communities. So that's my comment stroke question.
It's a great point. I think the key is they're parts of multiple communities at any one time. Like, I mean, how ridiculous to define people by an age group or a location or an educational status in life. I mean, how ridiculous. Not to understand that people are different things at different days. I always think, if I look back, I use Nuzzle. I don't know if you guys use Nuzzle. I look back in the latest 8 hours of content. Changes the nature of the content. If I look back for 2 hours, it's a completely different type of journalism. Now, if I look forward to my next day, I want to know more things about my commute. I'd want to know about, what's happening tomorrow in my locality. So the nature of my need has changed just by thinking about latency and forward and back. So what I'm saying is, you're absolutely right. At any moment, we might identify with multiple communities. And that's why personalization, chatbots, AI in general, collaborative filtering, as they call it, content recommendations, all these areas of science right now give me great hope, because it identifies need, not superficial want. How many times have you been chased by that handbag you bought 2 weeks ago, or that airline ticket you bought 2 months ago? That's the difference for me. That's why I'm a great believer in the power of this personal service to deliver the kind of trust that only comes from you believing the journalist has your back. And the final part I would say is the relationship between an individual and a news brand is being broken. The studies are showing us that people who consume news, particularly on social news feeds, don't remember where they got it from, but they will build relationships with individual journalists. And that's why I think, while funding memberships like Patreon may not scale for a news organization, they certainly could scale for the kind of niche journalism that I think is starting to flourish out of plain sight. Yes, just here.
Thank you, Mark, for your engaging talk there. This is probably going to be a bit of an awkward question, so I pre-apologize in advance. From the many hats that you've worn, might you have identified any situations or technologies or even innovations as such that at the time would have been viewed as not the healthiest, not the best thing to have happened, but in hindsight, we are probably at a better place right now for those technologies to have developed our situations?
Yeah, everything. I hated paywalls. I'm just trying to run through all the things I've been talking about. I mean, again, I think one of the classic, I overuse this line, it's the Samuel Beckett line: ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better. I am a big believer that the only lessons I've ever learned in my life are from my failures, not from my successes. And I think I include in that the mistakes I may have made about technology. But the one founding principle that's allowed me to work, hopefully, with innovators and build teams of innovators has been to observe the principle that you always should be looking at the momentum, not the object. Like, back in the day when they were choosing between Betamax and VHS, if you were obsessed with the format, you were going to miss what would eventually become a revolution in the way that we see imagery. And so therefore, I'm a big fan of that. Don't get too hooked up on whatever product feature you think is going to revolutionize the online news business. Think about the momentum and the changes in user behavior. And so for me right now, I look back and, as I say, subscription payments, I thought free was great. And that would be a fundamental mistake that I think I shared with the people who probably at the moment regret pushing stuff out for free. I would talk about the platforms because I have a much more, I think, sympathetic view of the quandary faced by many of the people, the good people, many of whom today are fighting the good fight inside the platforms. Because I think platforms have a sort of a sense that everything has to be a product team. So everything has to have a product solution. The problem is, a lot of the problems we have are not about building better products. You can't really build an algorithm for serendipity or for trust or for the things that actually make journalism so great. And I think you've got to be starting to think that, for me personally, that's one of the things I'd love would be for people with good intentions and platforms and publishers to realize that technology is not a straight line. I know they didn't want to be here, but it's a big issue that we've got to find a way that publishers and platforms can work together. We can take some of the mentality of a product team, the discipline, the scrum, the agile, and then mix it with some of the sort of unpredictable human qualities that come from a really chaotic, busy newsroom. If I could bring them both together, that would be my dream. The problem is it's kind of lost in translation. We're very similar, very introverted, but we speak different languages, and I really hope that's going to change. And again, all credit due to Facebook for having us here today. Okay, a few more minutes. Anyone else? There you go. Andrew's going to ask an awkward question. I know. He's got that look in his face.
No, I promise I won't. It's actually about trust. I think So I guess it's correct to say that we trust the familiar. We're starting out with our family and maybe things that we know. So as we move that into the unfamiliar, do you think that by passing transparency in still in a noisy environment, we can build trust, or is it also a matter of making it a smaller, transparent relationship?
Yeah, I think stripping away everything that gets in the way. I mean, clearly, part of the problem we have, I think, as online journalists, even the innovators in newsrooms, is that it's all about survival. This is what we've been given. If we wanted to change, we wouldn't start here, right? We just wouldn't. We've been given this reality. Nobody intended us to be in this situation. So the problem we have is that the people who are smart, innovative product teams in newsrooms are generally being orientated about trying to make a bad model work a little bit better. And I think that's the biggest enemy of innovation right now in news, is the need for survival, which I completely understand. I mean, the idea that we could all turn away and have a paid product, a direct transactional relationship with the user, it's just not going to be the way it's going to be for the next 5, 10 years for many news organizations. I don't underestimate the challenge of public service broadcasting organizations to find money to support journalism as a public utility. So survival is the enemy of innovation. And I think that's the biggest problem right now. So essentially, there has to be some way of creating a kind of parallel track in which, if we think about the user and stripping everything else away, but the connection between, and I would argue not the newsroom, but the journalist and the individual. And I think that's essentially a guiding principle. I'd love to find some cliches to stick up on walls, mantras, strip away everything but the need of that user, and that's your North Star. That's clearly not a 5-year plan. But in the great, techniques of agile, that's pretty much good enough already to start building new product teams. Keep surviving. I mean, please, I'm not asking everyone to jump off a cliff and commit harikiri, but at the same time, there has to be some consistency, having survival, but also with transformation at the same time. Mandy, are you pointing at someone else? Mandy Jenkins.
Hello. I hope this is working. Okay. Kind of taking a theme from this morning's keynote, but also a lot of what you've said. I guess what could you say to those who want to create a culture of innovation themselves inside of where they currently are? Whether they're a regular employee or they're the head of a company. From what you're looking at and what's gotten you going so far. I mean, what could people be doing to want to do that?
So I think this language, it's about getting rid of the language that we kind of tend to hear. I mean, there's kind of a nerd bingo that happens at conferences like this, and we kind of do actually feel like when we're talking among ourselves that everyone else outside will understand what a KPI is and how that's different from an OKR, have it by COB. And, there's a lot of terminology that I think we all use together as a shorthand. And it does bind us together. We're the insurgency, right? We are the rebels. Now, it's a bigger group than it was 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago. But I would love to find ourselves, first of all, finding language to talk to somebody who is toward the end of their career as a journalist and who, like me, finds out that they'll be a better journalist if they can unlock the pockets of wisdom in the community they already have. If you can find ways to establish a direct connection between those people and the hidden power of the communities that they have developed because of the respect for their journalism. So it's finding language to find the road, the person who really is in your way, and to explain to them that it's not about the inevitability of change and technology. Back to my original point, as agents of change, we completely underestimate the resistance that comes from good, honest people who just don't understand why things have to be different. And I think that's the same as I've come up against. And I've seen this, by the way, inside technology platforms as much as newsrooms, where this is the way we've always done the product process. You're asking us to come up with an algorithm for, as I say, serendipity. How do you measure dopamine, in a person's brain? And so as a result, I think resistance comes down to emotion, and people do fear the use of the language, I think, that we become so enamored with because, that's how we talk to each other. So I think giving someone a reason to change and give them the language to make sure that they realize you're on their side, in the same way as the user needs to know that you've got their back. That's why people trust journalists when they trust them, because they feel like we've got their back in a world that's gone crazy. And I think that's ultimately the same process around innovation, whether it be in a young startup, or it be in a newsroom, or it be in a publisher platform. One underestimated
skill that's not taught necessarily, I don't think. And the women leadership skills that are taught by ONA is a great example of this. Leadership skills in general should be, I think, taught in newsrooms. And what I mean by that is a great manager will convince everybody that they know what they're doing. And a good leader will convince everyone that works for them that they know what they're doing. Give them the power to go off and essentially create change themselves. So leadership skills, you should all be looking to your bosses to allow you to go off and talk to a management coach, because I think they are essentially what creates the culture of innovation and allows people to go off and build their own teams. So these are the things that I've kind of learned over the years as an old fart in this business. And failure. Bruce?
Mark, trust is a nice word, right? But let me ask you about two components or two things that either can be at odds with trust or part of it that are kind of kicking around in the world now. One is sensation, right? And the sensational. And as online news organizations rely a lot on arousal, on sensation, and it can be desire, it can be sexual, it can be fear, the sensation of fear, it can be the sensation of excitement, but getting eyeballs is exciting, but it can be at odds in some ways with trust, even as we feel we click on stuff, we don't trust our own impulses, let alone the people who are getting us to click. And that's deeply embedded now in social media. And on the other hand, there's also the question of equality, which is so important to trust. And for news, for social media, equality of access, equality of literacy. A lot of the resentment driving politics now is coming from people who feel lack of equality of access to the reward system and to the whole language that we in this room share. How do you think about issues like sensation and equality and how they relate to trust at a moment of crisis like this?
Yeah, I'm struck by the word distraction is the kind of thing that for me I can't get out of my mind at the moment. If you guys haven't heard of a movement called Time Well Spent by a guy called Tristan Harris, who's a former Google designer, he's set up essentially ways to protect ourselves from the manufactured addiction of how our phones work, our social networks work. To your point, the multitude of emotions you just listed there are really all revolving on the idea of, oh, there's another shiny thing, or there's another notification, or this is important, you got to see it. And I think we've got to a point now where that is eroding our own very sort of sense of our own control over our lives. And I think that for me, the next way forward is going to be thinking about things not as a never-ending scroll, right? You're standing for coffee, you got 2 minutes. You know, one of the great architects of the early wave of sort of social journalism used to say, well, I want to give you something in that 2 minutes that's going to make sure you're not bored, right? Well, that may have been okay back then. I want the opposite. At the moment of intent, I want to know that I can actually be rewarded for my intention at that moment by something that is complete and useful. Like, that's going to be the holy grail. Not a never-ending scroll that's going to give you a viral video about 1.5 minutes down. And that, for me, I think, is probably a way of answering your question about emotion, because the multitude of emotions necessary to grab you from away from something positive are generally angry, sad, and we become locked in our lives in this just constant scroll of happiness and sadness. And I think that, for me, is what I would ask people to look at as they're designing new product, is finding ways of that rewarding intention at the moment of intent for journalists. The second part about equality, you know, I think we can beat ourselves up continually about the fact that we in America live in a flyover society, that nobody sees the Midwest, and I'm not being dismissive of this yet, this right now, but I mean, there's greater equalities in our own societies in terms of our children and their ability to make sense of what they're seeing. You know, I have a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old, highly, highly intelligent kids. Do I have confidence in their literacy about what they're seeing? And the inequality of media literacy in the society today, whether it is in terms of people who have been native to the social web all their lives, you know, what happens to these kids when they get to 24, 25 and they realize this is not a playground? This is the only source of information you have. I think that's sort of my definition of inequality. And again, the progress was that the future's here. It's just unevenly distributed. And so is the, I think, knowledge that journalism represents. That would be my way of looking at that. But again, that's confirmation bias on my part. One way at the back, yeah.
Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Tell us my what?
A little bit more about your new venture that you mentioned in your presentation.
Well, first person I'm hiring is you. This is Louise Tierney, who I worked with at Storyful. No, I mean, I spent 4 months. If anyone here has worked within a social platform, they know that you become very much just about the thing you're working on. So I spent the last 4 months working with some very cool people who have taught me a lot. I worked a lot with Claire Wardle on First Draft, which, if you don't know, I'm sure everyone knows about the work of First Draft. There's like this wave of new reality coming at us. So learned a lot over the last few months from Claire, a lot from just meeting very generous people who kind of gave me an insight into the way things are changing for like people who are literally every day doing jobs that are changing every day. And I tried to find reasons not to do another startup. I really did. And my wife is here and she'll tell you that we debated this long and hard. And there it just comes to a point where you say, you know, why me, why now? And this, again, ridiculously excited, but this is so much more exciting even than back in 2010 when I found some common collaborators and founded Storyful. Like, this is a moment. And, you know, there is that terrible bullshit cliche about, like, if I look back in 20 years' time and I didn't do it now, I would really regret it. And so from that point of view, that's not really an option. But this time around, I got the benefit of knowledge about how you fail well. I have a ton of assumptions. And what I've realized is that, you know, you're in danger as a startup when you're always trying to answer the questions. You just try to find out what the questions are and start testing them and testing assumptions. So I've got, you know, now hopefully enough backing and a few people to help me spend 6 to 9 months testing some assumptions about just what I've talked about. How do we reward attention for people with intention? It's as sort of, again, complicated and as simple as that. It's a bit of a problem because when you've done it before, everyone expects it to be easy. And I could be back here sitting at the back really embarrassed that it all fucked up. But then, hey, that's where change comes from. And with that, that's time for a gin and tonic. Thank you.
All right. Mark, thank you. And soak it in. Well, thank you for that great talk, and we're really excited to hear more about that when the time is right. So for everyone in the room, hang tight. We're going to do some housekeeping, but first we're going to say goodbye to the live feed, goodbye to everyone who joined us to watch the talk. We really appreciate you joining us. And we're going to cut the live feed, and then there will be a pause, and Jess will come up, and she'll give you a little housekeeping. But she's going to talk about happy hour, so it's worth staying put for that so we know where to go. All right, so we'll wait for the signal for that, and